The night sky over Montana stretched endless and clear, scattered with more stars than Danny Carter could count. He sat in the backyard of his small house, bundled in his winter jacket, eye pressed against the telescope he had built himself from spare parts and instructions he found online. At 12 years old, Danny had already earned a reputation around town for being different. Not in a bad way, his teachers always said, just quiet and unusually focused for a boy his age. His father, Greg Carter, worked the night shift at the factory 3 times a week. Tonight was one of those nights, which meant Danny had the house to himself until morning. He did not mind. The quiet gave him time to think, to watch, to learn. Danny adjusted the telescope lens, bringing a distant cluster of stars into sharper focus. He had been tracking the movement of satellites earlier, noting their patterns in the small notebook he kept. Everything had patterns if you watched long enough. That was something Danny understood better than most people. A flash of light caught his attention. Not a shooting star or a plane. This light moved differently, zigzagging across the sky in ways that defied normal physics. Danny pulled back from the telescope, watching with his naked eyes as 3 distinct lights performed impossible maneuvers above the mountains. His heart started beating faster, but not from fear, from excitement and curiosity. He grabbed his notebook and began writing down everything he saw. The lights moved in a triangular formation, then broke apart, then reformed. They were controlled, deliberate, intelligent. Before Danny could process what he was seeing, one of the lights grew larger, much larger. It was coming toward him. The next moments happened so fast that Danny barely had time to react. A beam of bright blue light engulfed him, and he felt his feet leave the ground. His notebook fell from his hands, landing in the grass below. He tried to shout, but no sound came out. The world spun, colors blurred, and then everything went dark. When Danny opened his eyes, he was no longer in his backyard. He lay on a cold metal floor in a room with walls that seemed to glow with a faint purple light. His head ached, and his mouth felt dry. Slowly, carefully, he sat up and looked around. The room was small, maybe 12 feet across, with smooth walls that had no visible seams or doors. In one corner, he could see what looked like a window, but it showed nothing but darkness and distant stars. Danny realized with a sinking feeling that he was no longer on Earth. A section of the wall suddenly became transparent, and Danny could see into a larger space beyond. There were other rooms like his, arranged in rows, and in those rooms were other people. In the cell directly across from him, he saw Mrs. Lisa Bennett, his 7th-grade science teacher. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and eyes wide. 2 cells down, a large man with a graying beard paced back and forth. Further along, a woman in nurse's scrubs sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. Before Danny could try to signal to them, a door opened in the transparent wall. 3 figures entered the space between the cells. They were not human. The creatures stood on 2 legs and had 2 arms, but that was where the similarity ended. Their skin was covered in dark green scales that shifted to brown along their backs. Their heads were elongated, with yellow eyes that had vertical slits for pupils. When they moved, their tails swished behind them for balance. One of the creatures, taller than the others and wearing what looked like a uniform with silver markings, gestured toward Danny's cell. The transparent wall suddenly became opaque, blocking his view. Danny heard sounds from the other side, harsh clicking and hissing that might have been speech. Then the wall opened, and the 3 aliens entered his cell. Danny scrambled to his feet, his back against the far wall. The tall one studied him with those unsettling yellow eyes. It made more clicking sounds, and a device on its chest began to glow. A voice emerged, speaking English but with a strange mechanical quality. Specimen appears healthy, young, suitable for standard protocols. Danny's mind raced. Specimen. They thought he was some kind of animal to be studied. He forced himself to stay calm, to observe. The tall one had a device on its belt that looked like a weapon. The other 2 carried what might have been medical equipment. Their uniforms had symbols that repeated in patterns. Everything had patterns. One of the smaller aliens approached Danny with a device that hummed and glowed green. It passed the device over Danny's body, and numbers appeared on a small screen. Danny held still, watching everything, memorizing details. The tall alien made more clicking sounds. The translation device spoke again. Process with the others? Commander Zurith will inspect all specimens before departure to the station. They left as quickly as they had come, the wall sealing behind them. As soon as they were gone, the transparent section returned, and Danny could see the other cells again. Mrs. Bennett had seen him. She pressed her hands against her cell wall, her mouth forming words he could not hear. The large man had stopped pacing and was watching. The nurse had finally moved, standing now, alert. Danny took a deep breath and did what he always did when faced with a problem. He started gathering information. He studied the cell walls, running his hands along the smooth surface, feeling for any irregularity. He examined the transparent section, noting how it changed opacity. He looked at the locking mechanism where the door had appeared, searching for patterns in the metal.
The other prisoners were panicking.
Danny could see it in their faces, but panic would not help them. Clear thinking would, observation would, understanding the enemy would. Danny pressed his hand against the transparent wall and caught Mrs. Bennett's eye. He pointed to his eyes, then pointed around the room, then tapped his head. Watch everything. Remember everything. Think. She seemed to understand. She nodded slowly. Danny settled down on the floor, his back against the wall, and continued his observation. The aliens thought they had captured helpless prey. They had no idea what humans were capable of when pushed into a corner. They had no idea that the quiet boy from Montana was already forming a plan. They had made their first mistake when they underestimated him. Danny intended to make sure it would be their last. 2 days had passed since the abduction, or at least Danny thought it was 2 days. Time was hard to measure in the cell, but he had been counting the intervals between when the aliens brought food and when the lights dimmed slightly. Twice the tall alien, Commander Zereth, had walked past the cells with other crew members, gesturing at the prisoners and making those clicking sounds that the translation devices turned into cold, clinical assessments. Danny had learned something important during those 2 days. The aliens were careless around their captives. They spoke freely, assuming the humans could not understand anything beyond what the translators provided. They left equipment near the cells during inspections. They followed the same routines at the same times every cycle. On the third morning, 2 guards arrived at Danny's cell. The wall opened, and they gestured for him to come with them. Danny stood slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. The guards were smaller than Commander Zith, with lighter-colored scales and simpler uniforms. One of them carried a device that beeped softly whenever it pointed at Danny. They led him through a series of corridors. Danny walked slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The walls had colored strips running along them in patterns. Blue strips went one direction, green another, red a third. It was a navigation system, he realized. Simple and efficient. The guards brought him to a large room filled with strange equipment. Tables with straps. Machines with extending arms that ended in sharp instruments. Screens displaying symbols and numbers Danny could not read. A Vexnar in a white uniform stood waiting. This one was older, with darker scales and several scars across its snout. The white uniformed alien gestured to a table, and the guards forced Danny to lie down. Straps secured his arms and legs. Danny's heart pounded, but he kept his breathing steady. Fear would not help. Information would. The alien began its examination, passing scanners over Danny's body while making notes on a floating screen. It took samples of his hair and skin. It shined lights in his eyes and made him open his mouth. Through it all, Danny watched and listened. A younger Vexnar entered the room carrying a tray of instruments. This one had bright green scales and moved with less confidence than the others. It set the tray down and began organizing the tools, accidentally dropping one. The older alien hissed in annoyance, and the younger one flinched. "Apologies, Dr. Vexthor," the translator on the young one's chest said. "I will be more careful." "See that you are, Kryle," the doctor replied. "These specimens may be primitive, but the research must be precise." Krill picked up the dropped instrument and glanced at Danny. For just a moment, their eyes met. Danny saw something in that gaze. Uncertainty. Maybe even discomfort. Danny made a choice. He let fear show on his face, let his eyes water slightly, let his breathing become faster. He acted like the scared child they expected to see. Krill looked away quickly, focusing on arranging the instruments. "Doctor." Vexthor continued the examination, occasionally speaking to himself about bone density and muscle composition. "Fascinating how similar their biology is to the Corvin species," he muttered. "Yet they have no space travel, no advanced technology. They should not have survived this long on such a hostile world." Danny filed away every word. The Corvin species. They had compared humans to another species. That meant there were records, databases, information he could potentially use. The examination lasted for what felt like hours. When it finally ended, Dr. Vexthor unstrapped Danny and stepped back. "Return the specimen to its cell," he told the guards. "Schedule it for transport to Station Omega with the others." They arrive in 2 cycles. As the guards led Danny back through the corridors, he walked even more slowly than before, memorizing the route. Blue strip, turn right. Green strip, turn left. Red strip, straight ahead. He counted the doors they passed. noted which ones had keypads with colored buttons and which ones had biometric scanners. When they returned him to his cell, the transparent wall was active. Mrs. Bennet, the large man, and the nurse were all visible in their cells. Danny caught their attention and made a subtle gesture, pointing to his eyes and then around the room. They had been watching too. Good. That evening, when the food arrived through a slot in the wall, Danny examined it carefully. A gray paste with some kind of vegetable matter and protein cubes. Not appetizing, but edible. More importantly, the slot mechanism was simple. It opened from the outside, but Danny could see the edges of the panel. Given the right tools, it could be opened from the inside, too. A soft tapping sound drew his attention. It came from above, from the ventilation grate in the ceiling. Danny stood on his toes and listened. The tapping came in patterns. Short, long, short. Someone was trying to communicate. Danny grabbed his food tray and tapped back against the wall. Short, short, long. The pattern change became more complex. It was a code, Danny realized. Someone in another cell block had figured out they could communicate through the ventilation system. Over the next several hours, Danny worked out a basic system of communication with whoever was on the other end. They established simple signals for yes, no, question, and danger. It was not much, but it was a start. The lights dimmed for what passed as night on the ship. Danny lay on the hard bench that served as a bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind worked through everything he had learned. The color-coded navigation system, the routine schedules, the ventilation network, Krill's hesitation, Dr. Vexthor's mention of Station Omega, the 2-cycle deadline. In his cell across the way, the large man caught Danny's eye. The man pointed to himself and mouthed the word, Pete.
He was telling Danny his name. The nurse did the same.
Karen. Mrs. Bennet waved slightly, and Danny already knew her name. Danny pointed to himself and mouthed back, Danny. Pete held up his hands and made a gesture like he was working on something mechanical. He was telling Danny he had skills. Karen pointed to a cross symbol on her scrubs. Medical knowledge. Mrs. Bennet made a writing motion. Teacher. Danny felt something shift inside him. They were not just prisoners anymore. They were becoming a team. Each person had something to offer, some knowledge or skill that could help. He thought about his father, probably frantic with worry back on Earth. He thought about his home, his school, everything he had been taken from. The Vexnare thought they had captured weak, helpless creatures to experiment on. Danny pressed his hand against the transparent wall and looked at the others. He made a fist and nodded once. A promise. They had made a mistake taking humans. Danny was going to make sure they understood that mistake completely. The morning of the 4th day brought new opportunities. Danny woke to the sound of the ventilation system humming to life, and with it came more tapping from above. The communication network was growing. Someone else had joined, tapping in different patterns. Then another. Prisoners throughout the ship were connecting, sharing the code Danny had helped establish. When the guards came with breakfast, Danny watched carefully through the transparent wall as they delivered food to each cell. They followed the exact same pattern every time. Left side first, then right side, then the cells in the back. Each guard carried a control device on their belt that made the food slots open. The devices had 3 colored buttons, red, blue, yellow. After the guards left, Danny stood beneath the ventilation grate and tapped out a message. He used the basic code to ask questions. How many prisoners? The response came back slowly, transmitted cell to cell. Many. More than 20 just in this section. Danny tapped again. Other species? The answer surprised him. Yes. Not just humans. The Vexnare had been collecting specimens from multiple worlds. Mrs. Bennet was watching Danny from her cell. When he caught her eye, she pointed to the food slot in her wall, then made a pulling motion. She had been examining it, too. Danny nodded and showed her his own observations, pointing to the edges where the panel mechanism was visible. Pete, the large man with the beard, had been doing something different. He had been listening. When the guards walked past, when machinery operated in distant parts of the ship, Pete pressed his ear against the wall and listened to everything. Now he caught Danny's attention and pointed to his ear, then to the wall, then made a gesture like something breaking. He had heard something wrong with the ship's systems, something not working properly. Karen, the nurse, had been rationing her food. Danny noticed she only ate half of each meal, saving the rest. When she saw him watching, she held up the gray paste and made a mixing motion with her fingers. She was experimenting with the food, seeing what could be done with it. Smart. The transparent walls suddenly went opaque. Danny heard the familiar clicking sounds of Vexnar's speech in the corridor, multiple voices, including the deep, commanding tone of Zith. Danny pressed his ear against the wall where Pete had shown him and listened. The translation was muffled, but Danny caught pieces. Station Omega confirms receipt. Prepare specimens for transfer. High-value cargo. Significant profit. Another voice responded, older and more cautious. Commander, I reviewed the data on the human homeworld. Their history shows remarkable adaptation and problem-solving abilities. Perhaps we should reconsider, Dr. Vexthor. Your concerns are noted and dismissed. Zarith's voice cut in. They are primitives. They have no defense against our technology. The station expects delivery in one cycle, and we will not disappoint them. The voices faded as the Vexnar moved away. The transparent walls reactivated. Danny saw the fear in the other prisoners' faces. One cycle meant roughly 24 hours. Tomorrow they would reach the station, and escape would become nearly impossible. Danny tapped urgently on the wall beneath the ventilation grate. The code system had improved over the past day, allowing for more complex messages. Danny sent out a question to the network. Can anyone reach their control panels? The responses came back slowly. No. Maybe. Wait. 5 minutes passed. Then a new pattern came through the ventilation. Different tapping, from someone further away. This pattern was not in the code Danny had helped create. It was something else entirely. Musical, almost. Not human. Danny tapped back carefully, trying to mimic the pattern. The response came quicker this time, adjusting, learning. Over the next hour, Danny established contact with something non-human. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to understand the concept of cooperation. It could reach its control panel, and it had been studying the lock mechanism. By midday, Danny had a network of information flowing through the ventilation system. The non-human prisoner, who Danny started thinking of as click speech because of the musical tapping pattern, had made contact with others of its kind in different sections. Together they had figured out that the door controls worked on a color sequence: red, yellow, blue. But only during specific times. Pete had discovered something important by listening to the walls. The ship's power system cycled every 6 hours for maintenance. During the cycle, there was a brief moment, maybe 30 seconds, when secondary systems like cell locks drew from backup power. The locks still worked, but they were slower to respond. Karen had made a breakthrough with the food. The gray paste, when dried and compressed, became slightly adhesive. Mixed with water from their drinking supply, it could be molded. It was not strong, but it could be shaped. She demonstrated by pressing some against her cell wall, where it stuck for several minutes before falling. Mrs. Bennett had been counting and timing everything. Guard rotations, food deliveries, announcement patterns. She had created a mental schedule of the ship's entire routine. Using hand signals and gestures visible through the transparent walls, she shared this information with Danny, Pete, and Karen. Danny synthesized everything he had learned. He had a network of prisoners. He had information about lock mechanisms and power cycles. He had materials that could be shaped, ears that could hear structural weaknesses, and eyes that had memorized the ship's layout. He had an ally in Krill, the young technician who showed discomfort with the experiments, and he had a deadline. One cycle. 24 hours. That evening, when Krill came to collect samples from the cells, Danny made his move. As the young Vexnar entered his cell, Danny did not back away. Instead, he looked directly at Krill and spoke clearly. You know this is wrong. Krill froze. The translator device processed Danny's words, but the technician did not respond. You dropped that instrument during my examination because your hands were shaking, Danny continued. You look away when Dr. Vexthor talks about us like we are things instead of people. You know this is wrong. Krill's yellow eyes met Danny's. For a long moment, neither moved. I cannot help you, Krill finally said, his voice translated into flat, emotionless English by the device. Commander Zareth would have me executed. I am not asking you to help us, Danny said carefully. I am just asking you not to be surprised when we help ourselves. Krill stared at Danny, confusion clear in his scaled face. Then, without another word, he collected his samples and left quickly. But Danny noticed something. Krill did not fully seal the control panel on the wall when he closed the cell door. The mechanism clicked, but not completely. It was not much. Maybe Krill had done it on purpose, maybe not. But it was something. Through the transparent wall, Pete gave Danny a thumbs up. Karen nodded slowly. Mrs. Bennett smiled for the first time since the capture. Danny returned to the ventilation grate and tapped out the most important message yet. Tomorrow. Be ready. Together. The responses came back from throughout the ship, from humans and non-humans alike, from dozens of cells and multiple species. The message was clear. Ready? The ship's lighting dimmed for the final sleep cycle before arrival at Station Omega. Danny did not sleep. Instead, he pressed his ear against the wall, listening to the deep hum of the ship's engines. Pete had taught him what to listen for, the rhythm and pattern of machinery working properly. Danny heard it now. Steady and constant, but in 6 hours it would change. The power cycle would begin, and they would have their moment. Through the ventilation grate, messages traveled back and forth across the ship. Click Speech had rallied 7 other members of its species spread across 3 cell blocks. They had strong limbs that could pry open panels if given enough time. Karen had distributed her adhesive paste through the ventilation system, passing small amounts from cell to cell. Mrs. Bennett had synchronized everyone's timing using a count system based on heartbeats. When the moment came, everyone would move together. The first sign of dawn came with the brightening of the lights. Danny stood and stretched, acting normal for any cameras that might be watching. The guards arrived with breakfast right on schedule. Danny ate slowly, watching through the transparent wall as Pete pressed his ear against his cell wall. The big man held up 5 fingers, then made a circular motion. 5 hours until the power cycle. An hour later, the ship's intercom system activated. Commander Zurith's voice, translated into multiple languages, echoed through the corridors. Attention crew. We approach Station Omega. Prepare all specimens for transfer. This delivery will bring significant profit to our operation. The humans in particular will fetch excellent prices for their unusual biology. Danny felt anger rise in his chest but pushed it down. Anger would not help. Cold calculation would. Doctor. Vexthor arrived with Krill and another technician. They moved from cell to cell, scanning each prisoner one final time and marking data on their floating screens. When they reached Danny's cell, the wall opened and Vexthor entered with his scanner. Remarkable specimen, Vexthor muttered to Krill. Young, healthy, and the brain scans show unusual activity patterns. The research facilities will be very interested. Krill said nothing, but Danny noticed the young technician's hands trembled slightly as he held the data pad. Tell me, Krill, Danny said quietly, what happened to the last group of specimens you delivered to Station Omega? Krill's eyes widened. Vexthor stopped his scanning and turned to stare at Danny. They do not return, Danny continued. You know that. Whatever experiments happen there, the specimens do not survive. You have done this before. How many? Silence, Vexthor snapped. Specimens do not question their purpose. But Danny had seen what he needed to see. Krill's face showed guilt and shame. The young Vexnar knew exactly what fate awaited the prisoners. After the doctors left, Danny tapped out an urgent message through the ventilation. The response came back quickly. Quick Speech had heard everything through its own grate. The message spread throughout the ship. All the prisoners now understood that this was not just about escape. This was about survival. 3 hours until the power cycle. The ship began its approach to Station Omega. Through the small window in his cell, Danny could see a massive structure growing larger in the distance. The station was enormous, a sprawling complex of metal and lights that dwarfed the Vexnar ship. Hundreds of vessels surrounded it, coming and going like insects around a hive. Danny's resolve hardened. If they did not act now, they would disappear into that station and never be seen again. 2 hours. Guards began moving through the corridors more frequently, preparing for the transfer. Danny noticed they were distracted, focused on their duties rather than the prisoners. Perfect. 1 hour. Pete pressed his ear against the wall and held up one finger. The power cycle was about to begin. Danny moved to his cell door where Krill had left the panel slightly unsealed. He worked his fingers into the tiny gap and waited. The lights flickered once. The hum of the engine shifted, dropping in pitch. The power cycle had started. Danny pulled hard on the panel. It resisted, then suddenly gave way with a soft click. The control mechanism was exposed, showing 3 colored buttons and a series of wires. Danny remembered everything he had observed. Red, yellow, blue. He pressed them in sequence. Nothing happened. Danny's heart raced. He tried again. Red, yellow, blue. Still nothing. Then he remembered. The buttons were not just a sequence. They needed to be pressed simultaneously, like a chord. Danny pressed all 3 at once. The cell door opened. Through the transparent walls, Danny saw the others working. Pete had forced his panel open with sheer strength. Karen used a piece of metal she had sharpened over days to pry her controls free. Mrs. Joy. Bennett, smaller and less strong, was struggling. Danny rushed to the control system for her cell. The corridor controls were more complex, but they followed the same color logic. He pressed the right combination, and Mrs. Bennett's door opened. She stepped out, breathing hard but determined. "The others?" she said, pointing down the corridor where more cells held more prisoners. Danny and Pete worked together, opening cell after cell. Humans stumbled out, confused and frightened but free. 3 people in total from their block alone. An alarm began to wail. "They know," Karen said. "What now?" Danny pointed to the red strip on the wall. "We follow the colors to the communications hub. Click Speech and the others will create diversions in the other sections. We need to move fast." They ran through the corridors, following the navigation system Danny had memorized. Behind them they heard shouting in the Vexnar language and the heavy footsteps of guards responding. A guard appeared ahead, weapon raised. But before it could fire, Pete charged forward with surprising speed for his size and tackled the alien to the ground. Karen grabbed the fallen weapon while Mrs. Quinson, Bennett helped Pete restrain the guard. "Keep moving," Pete said, breathing hard. "I will catch up." They turned a corner and nearly collided with Krill. The young technician stood frozen, staring at the escaped prisoners. His hand moved toward the communication device on his belt. Danny stepped forward. "You can sound the alarm, or you can let us pass. Either way, we are not going to that station." Krill's hand hesitated over the device. His yellow eyes moved from Danny to the other humans, seeing their determination, their unity. Slowly, deliberately, Krill stepped aside and turned his back. "I saw nothing," the translator said quietly. Danny nodded once in gratitude, and the group rushed past. The communications hub was close now, just 2 more corridors away. The ship shook suddenly, and Danny realized other groups were causing chaos throughout the vessel. ClickSpeech and its people were doing their part. They reached the hub to find 2 technicians at the controls. Before the Vexnar could react, the humans swarmed into the room. Karen still held the weapon, but did not fire. Instead, Mrs. Bennett stepped forward with the sedative paste they had been saving, forcing the technicians to ingest it. Within seconds, both aliens slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Danny approached the main console. It was covered in alien symbols and controls he did not fully understand, but the transmission system had a universal structure. Input, frequency, amplification, output. He had seen enough technology to recognize the basics. His fingers moved over the controls, adjusting frequencies to broadcast on every channel. Then he spoke clearly into the communication device. "This is Danny Carter from Earth. We are prisoners aboard a Vexnar vessel approaching Station Omega. They have taken people from multiple worlds for illegal experimentation. We are here. We need help. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need help." He repeated the message, broadcasting it across every frequency he could find. The door burst open. Commander Zurith stood there with 6 armed guards, weapons pointed directly at the humans. "Foolish children," Zurith hissed, his translator spitting out the words. "You have only made your deaths more painful." Danny stood tall, facing the commander without fear. "Maybe, but now everyone knows what you have been doing. And that was your real mistake. You thought no one cared about us." "You were wrong." Commander Zurith took a step into the communications hub, his weapon raised. The other guards flanked him, creating a wall of scales and weapons between the humans and any hope of escape. Danny stood his ground, his hand still on the transmission controls, broadcasting his distress call into the darkness of space. "You will shut down that transmission immediately," Zurith commanded, "or I will execute 1 prisoner every 10 seconds until you comply. Mrs." Bennett moved closer to Danny, placing herself between him and the weapons. Pete stepped forward too, his large frame blocking as many of the others as possible. Karen held the stolen weapon, but her hands shook. They all knew they were outmatched. Then the ship shook violently. Zurith stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe. Red emergency lights began flashing throughout the corridor. A voice crackled over the intercom in the Vexnar language, urgent and alarmed. "Commander, we have incoming vessels. Multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. They are surrounding us and demanding we power down weapons and prepare for boarding." Zurith's eyes widened. He snarled something at his guards and turned to leave the communications hub, but stopped when a new voice filled the room. This one came from the transmission console, speaking in clear, measured English. "Vexnar vessel, this is Ambassador Quellen of the Galactic Coalition cruiser Harmony's Dawn. We received a distress call from prisoners aboard your ship. You are in violation of 47 Coalition laws regarding the capture and trafficking of sentient beings. Power down your weapons and surrender your vessel immediately, or we will disable your ship and take you by force." Danny felt relief wash over him so powerfully that his legs nearly gave out. They had come. Someone had actually heard his message and come to help. Zirith's face twisted with rage and something else. Fear. He grabbed his communication device and spoke quickly. "This is a private research vessel. You have no authority here. Leave immediately or we will consider your approach an act of aggression." "Your ship's signature matches 17 documented raids on protected worlds," the ambassador's voice replied. "We have been tracking your operation for 2 standard years. The prisoner's transmission gave us your exact location. This is your final warning. Surrender now." The ship shook again, more violently this time. Zirith looked at his guards, then at the humans, calculating his options. Danny could see the commander's mind working, searching for a way out. "If we're going down," Zareth said slowly, his translator making his words sound cold and mechanical, "then you prisoners will not survive to testify." He raised his weapon toward Danny. The shot never came. Krill appeared in the doorway behind Zirith, holding a small device. He pressed it against the commander's back, and Zirith convulsed once before collapsing to the floor, unconscious. The guards spun around, but Krill had already dropped the stunning device and raised his hands. "I am surrendering to the Coalition forces," Krill said, his voice shaking. "I will testify to everything. Every raid, every specimen, every crime. All of it." The guards looked at each other uncertainly. Without their commander's orders, they seemed lost. One by one, they lowered their weapons. The next hour passed in a blur. Coalition forces boarded the ship, their soldiers wearing sleek armor in silver and blue. They secured the Vexnar crew without violence and began releasing prisoners from every section of the vessel. Danny watched as Click Speech emerged from its cell, a being that looked like a combination of an insect and a bird, with 4 arms and crystalline wings. The creature approached Danny and made a series of musical sounds. A Coalition translator provided the meaning. The small human kept his word. We are free. Ambassador Quellen came personally to the communications hub. She was tall and covered in golden fur, with features that reminded Danny of a lion but also somehow human. Her eyes were kind but sharp, missing nothing. "You are Danny Carter," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "The one who organized this uprising." "Everyone helped," Danny said quickly. "It was not just me." "Humility," Quellen observed, a hint of a smile crossing her feline features. "Unusual in one so young who has accomplished so much." "Tell me, Danny Carter, how did a 12-year-old child from a planet with no space travel manage to defeat a Vexnar operation that has eluded our forces for years?" Danny thought about his answer carefully. "They thought we were animals. That made them careless. They never expected us to watch them, learn from them, work together. That was their mistake." Quellen nodded slowly. "Indeed. We have been monitoring Earth for some time, debating whether your species was ready for contact. I believe you have answered that question quite definitively." Over the following days, Danny and the other prisoners were cared for aboard the Coalition vessels. Medical teams treated their injuries and provided counseling for their trauma. Danny learned that the Coalition had raided Station Omega immediately after rescuing the ship, freeing thousands of prisoners from dozens of different species. The entire Vexnar trafficking operation had been dismantled in one decisive action. Krill testified to everything, providing evidence that led to arrests across multiple star systems. In exchange for his cooperation and his actions helping the prisoners, he received a reduced sentence and a possibility of rehabilitation. The journey back to Earth took a week. Ambassador Quellen spent time with Danny, teaching him about the Coalition, about the hundreds of species that work together across the galaxy, about the laws and principles that governed interstellar relations. "Your world will receive an invitation to join the Coalition as an observer species," Quellen told him. "It is a first step toward full membership. Thanks largely to you, Danny Carter, the galaxy now sees humanity differently." "How?" Danny asked. "They see you as survivors." "As problem solvers, as beings capable of cooperation and courage, even in the darkest circumstances. The story of the human child who freed an entire ship has already spread to 40 different worlds." When the Coalition ship entered Earth's orbit, Danny pressed his face against the observation window, staring at the blue and green sphere below. Home. It looked impossibly beautiful after everything he had been through. The landing site was a military base in Montana, not far from Danny's home. When the ship's door opened and Danny stepped out onto Earth's soil, the first person he saw was his father. Greg Carter stood behind a security barrier, his face showing every moment of the terror and hope he had experienced over the past 2 weeks. When he saw Danny, he vaulted the barrier despite the protests of security personnel and ran to his son. They crashed together in an embrace, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "I knew you would come home," Greg said, his voice breaking. "I knew you would find a way." Danny hugged his father tighter. "I learned from you, Dad. You always taught me to stay calm and think through problems." The reunion was covered by every news organization on Earth. Within hours, the entire planet knew what had happened. Danny Carter became famous overnight, but he did not want fame. He just wanted to go home. 6 months later, Danny sat in his backyard with his telescope, the same one he had been using the night of his abduction. But now, when he looked at the stars, he knew what was out there. He knew the galaxy was full of life, full of species both good and bad, full of possibilities. His father sat beside him in a lawn chair, content just to be near his son. "Ambassador Quellen sent another message today," Greg said. "She wants to know if you would consider being a youth liaison for Earth's observer delegation. You would not have to decide until you are older." Danny adjusted his telescope, focusing on a distant star system he now knew was home to Click Speech's people, maybe someday. "Right now, I just want to be a kid for a while." "Good answer," Greg said, from inside the house. Danny's phone buzzed. Messages from Mrs. Bennett, Pete, and Karen. They had formed a support group for the returned prisoners and met every week. They were helping each other process what had happened and assisting the government in preparing for formal contact with the coalition. Danny looked up at the stars again and smiled. The Vexnair had thought they were capturing a weak, helpless child from a primitive world. Instead, they had learned what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to the edge. They had learned that underestimating humans was the gravest mistake they could make. The galaxy was watching Earth now, not with pity or contempt, but with respect and curiosity. And somewhere out there, on dozens of different worlds, beings told the story of Danny Carter, the human child who turned from target to threat and changed how the universe saw his entire species. Danny picked up his notebook and made a simple entry. Day 187 since returning home. Everything is different now. Everything is better. He closed the notebook, looked at his father, and smiled. They were going to be okay out there. All of them. Together,